Hi, welcome to our second video. In the first video, we reviewed SVI sentence patterns, the SVTDO sentence pattern, and we talked about simple sentences and compound sentences. Now we're ready to go on to complex sentences. Leah, what is a complex sentence?
A complex sentence consists of one independent clause with a subject and a verb, and another
a dependent clause
with a subject and a verb,
joined by
a relative pronoun or subordinating conjunction.
Very good. To make a complex sentence, we need one independent clause. What is a clause?
A clause is a group of words that does contain both a subject and a verb.
A clause is a group of words that does contain both a subject and a verb. So we need one independent clause. That means it can stand by itself. And we need one dependent clause, which means it is dependent upon the independent clause to make sense. So the way we join those two clauses together is that we use a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. And if you look on chart H, your conjunction chart, you have that list of subordinating conjunctions and also down here of the relative pronouns. If you use a subordinating conjunction, you are using an adverbial clause, and you're adding an adverbial clause to your sentence. You're talking more about a verb. If you use a relative pronoun, you are making an adjectival dependent clause, and so you're going to be describing a noun. So let's first start. Again, let's go back to our two independent clauses. Harold rolled, he eats bugs. I'm going to go ahead and erase my SVTDO, and now what I want to do is I want to make Harold rolled into a complex sentence. Harold rolled, that's independent, has a subject and a verb, it can stand by itself. But I want to add more information to my sentence, and I'm going to focus on my verb, so I'm going to add an adverbial dependent clause. Harold rolled, why? Because Joel
rolled him,
tossed him.
Oh.
Now I have a complex sentence. Harold rolled, that is independent. It can stand all by itself. But look at this. Because Joel tossed him. Well, that can't be by itself because it doesn't make sense alone. So that's called a dependent clause. It depends on the independent clause to hold itself together. Now look, here's the rule for commas. If I have an independent clause, then a subordinating conjunction, and an dependent clause, I do not use a comma. But if I were to start this with a dependent clause, then a subordinating conjunction, and then an independent clause, I would put a comma after the dependent clause. So if I said, because Joel tossed him, Harold rolled, because Joel tossed him, comma, Harold rolled. Then I would need a comma. Do you have a question, Joel?
The subordinating conjunction come first?
Then it would be at the beginning. That's true. Thank you. That's a good correction. Here we would start with the subordinating conjunction, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. That's exactly right. Okay, let's look at this one. Harold ate. Now let's look at our list of subordinating conjunctions. We already used because. Harold ate, I could use when, while, where, as, since, if, although, whereas, unless, because. We already used because.
If you make that sentence.
So what we're going to do is we're going to choose one of these to make this a complex sentence. What would you like to use this time?
Harold ate since he was hungry.
Harold ate since he was hungry.
For the sentence, Harold rolled because Joel tossed him.
Uh-huh.
How would you make it imperative?
Ooh, that's it. We'll go back to that in just a minute. What a great question. Harold ate since he was hungry. Why did Harold eat? Well, he ate since he was hungry. This tells us more about the verb, so it's called an adverbial clause. Both of these used a subordinating conjunction. And whenever we use a subordinating conjunction, we are adding an adverbial dependent clause to our sentence. I know it is a clause because a clause has both a subject and a verb. So look right here. Harold rolled, Harold ate. These are independent clauses. They can be by themselves. Because Joel tossed him, I have a subject and a verb. Since he was hungry, I have a subject and a verb. But neither of those can be by themselves, so they are dependent. Now let's do a different kind. This time, we're going to use a relative pronoun. And we are going to tell more about mom. So I am going to add a who clause, which we learned about in IEW way back at the beginning of the year. Those are complex sentences when I just add a who clause because who is a relative pronoun. So I could say mom. Which mom? The mom who
erased the board.
Well, tell me something different because we're going to leave this here.
Mom who is beautiful.
Oh, mom who is beautiful erased the board. Now, this is an adjectival phrase because this one begins with a relative pronoun. This is the subject and this is the verb. But if I just say, who is beautiful as a statement, that doesn't make sense. Who is beautiful? Well, I don't know. It doesn't make sense. But look, mom erased the board. I have a subject and a verb. So mom erased the board is an independent clause. It has a subject and a verb. It can stand alone. Who is beautiful is a dependent clause. It depends on the independent clause. All of these are examples of complex sentences. Now we've talked about compound sentences and we've talked about complex sentences. And now we're going to go right here to compound complex. Compound complex sentences just combine the two together. So a compound complex sentence. Do you guys remember the definition of this?
Compound complex sentences
Consists of at least
one.
Oh,
At least
two independent clauses with a subject and a verb, and at least one independent clause with a subject and a verb. And I think we did it a little, a dependent clause. And so we did this a little bit differently. I think we said a compound complex sentence consists of one independent clause with a subject and a verb, and another independent clause with a subject and a verb, joined by a coordinating conjunction, and at least one dependent clause with a subject and a verb, joined by a subordinate clause or a relative pronoun. Okay?
Conjunction?
What did I say, clause? A subordinate conjunction. All right. So we can take, let's do the bottom one because it'll be easier. Mom who was beautiful erased the board. Now I need to add another independent clause with a conjunction. Mom who was beautiful erased the board. Joel, help me out.
And she taught us.
And she taught us. Okay? Mom who was beautiful erased the board, comma, because I have a conjunction, and she taught us. Well, let's look. We have a lot going on here, but we've kind of identified the subject and the verb in our dependent clause. In our first independent clause, let's look at this. She taught us. What's the verb?
Taught.
Taught. What's the subject?
She.
So let's look. We actually have 3 clauses in this sentence. What is a clause?
A clause is like a group of words that does contain both a subject and a verb.
Okay, so let's look. We have mom erased the board. That's one independent clause. Does that make sense by itself? Yeah. We have another independent clause. She taught us. Does that make sense by itself?
Yep.
Yeah. So we have an independent clause, another independent clause, joined with a coordinating conjunction. And then I have another clause, but this one is dependent, who is beautiful. So look at that. I have three different clauses. I have two independent clauses and a dependent clause. This is now a compound, complex sentence because it contains, do this with me,
Contains
one independent clause with a subject and a verb, and another independent clause with a subject and a verb, and at least one dependent clause with a subject and a verb. Okay? Joined by a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Okay, so that is how we get to a compound, complex sentence. We're going to just take what we know about compound sentences, what we know about complex sentences, we're going to combine them, and then we have compound, complex. In our next video, we are going to walk through an ATS sentence, so the analytical task for a sentence, and go ahead and look at this in a little more detail.